and welcome once again to the Syria podcast. I am delighted today to be joined by Vanessa Beeley as usual, but also Myriam Charabaty for the first time on the UK column. Welcome, Myriam.
Thank you both for having me. I look forward to talking more about this.
And as usual, this is the Syria podcast, but we're really talking regional issues. And so, although undoubtedly Syria is going to be part of this, the other activities that are going on in the region are, of course, going to be part of this as well. And the latest is apparently the Strait of Hormuz is closed again, and Trump is about to start bombing again. Um, Hands up, everybody on this discussion that wasn't expecting this. Glad to see neither of you put your hands up. So, Miriam, just tell us how you think things are going to develop over the next little period, because obviously there's been claims of ceasefires which haven't really been ceasefires.
Well, the ceasefire is a simple peace between battles kind of thing. It's a different version of the battle, so they're trying to achieve through diplomacy and indirect military actions what they could not achieve on the ground. And it's the same thing in Lebanon. And it usually always comes after heavy failures, like heavy blows, in which the military actually no longer has the capacity to achieve the goals initially set. So they need to maneuver a bit, regroup, regather, change a bit in the plans, try to find a new bank of targets. Because for the large part, I think they they attempted a lot of targets in Iran and in Lebanon, and largely they were targeting ambushes. So they were targeting props, they were targeting now emptied locations, and that kind of increased the margin of failure of the Americans in the face of the Iranian and the resistance capacity in Lebanon, because this happened in both places at obviously the different ranges and different margins, but it happened in both places. And so now when Trump says we are gonna keep the blockade, because Hormuz closed again because of the blockade, and the way the Iranians explain that is that the blockade is another way for American piracy, right? So instead of getting on the ground and taking the oil, they're now pirating ships that have done so legally in Iran and taking the products. Because I don't think it was only oil that they would plan to pirate. So in that respect, it is inevitable that we will see another rise in escalations. Now, what that rise looks like, in my humble opinion, it might be worse and heavier than anything we saw before, for two main reasons. One, Iran um, cannot be as nice as they were in the first round. So yes, they had foregone a lot of their restraints, which they had for the past 50 years, 47 years. But in this round, they will forego even more of their restraints, and that increases the potential of strikes targeting American presence in the Gulf in Iraq. Uh, Potentially, it could even go as far as targeting US presence in Lebanon, even though that specifically has, I believe it has a different way of being perceived for both the Iranians and the resistance, given that um, the specificity of Lebanon and the presence of the resistance in it and the locations, and especially now with the forcibly displaced being integrated into um, regions which are highly, in some places, a highly pro-US backed kind of thing. Um, so from that perspective, I think we're about to see a bigger confrontation, and we're definitely going to see a bigger maritime confrontation. I also think, correct me if I'm wrong, Vanessa, but I think a third aircraft carrier kind of moved in to the Middle East yesterday,
Yeah.
headed towards us. And so that doesn't happen without plans of continuing a war, because now the mere presence of the military, U.S. military, in West Asia is actually attrition. it is by itself a type of attrition, right? They cannot leave because if they leave, they will never return. And them staying here is costing them a lot. I think we saw a lot of the concerns of U.S. Troops on aircraft carriers, especially with the food thing coming out lately. It's basically they're not eating, to put it that way. They're on some sort of fasting. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think we're headed towards another war, another kinetic war. To put it that way.
Vanessa, the rhetoric from the Trump administration over the last week or so has been that this business of Iran's having to dig their weapons out of the ground because we've blown everything up to the point that they can't, and my question is, what is the truth of this in Iran? In the past you've discussed how Iran has a manufacturing capability which is absolutely able to keep up with what they have been doing up to this point. Does that still apply if this escalates further?
Well, funnily enough, I think yesterday I saw a tweet from one of the military analysts from inside Iran that actually said the production of the suicide drones is 10 times greater than it was before the 40-day war began. And I think while, the focus is very much on perhaps the US side because we're being inundated with lunatic rhetoric from Trump and his administration reference what is going on. I mean, it's literally schizophrenic. It's flipping from one side to the other very rapidly. But in fact, the pause itself, as Myriam said, it's not. None of us really perceive it as a ceasefire. It's an agreed upon pause, just as actually the ceasefire in Lebanon, and Myriam can fill in a bit more about that. It hasn't, in effect, been a ceasefire. It's been a regrouping and a repositioning. Obviously, for the Zionist forces that were taking a major beating despite the asymmetric nature of this war on the ground, even the most elite forces within the Zionist military were unable to effectively take full control of a single major city in the south, and that includes Bint Jbeil, which is 3 kilometers in from the southern border, and which for the Zionists is a target from a revenge perspective, because they have been again defeated, unceremoniously there previously in 2006 with the assassination of one of their senior commanders. So for them, this is a personal vendetta in Bint Jbeil. And I think for Iran, there hadn't been, as far as I'm aware from the people that I've spoken to, any actual damage to the missile cities underground, because that's virtually impossible unless you start using tactical nukes or heavy duty bombing campaigns, which we haven't really seen so far. But there is probably debris at the entrance to these missile cities. The Iranian forces that are obviously operating within the missile cities haven't seen potentially daylight or haven't been released from those positions for the duration of the 40 days. And so therefore, I think for Iran, this was an important pause to reestablish transport lines, railway lines, bridges, etc., very quickly within that space of time for civilians. Also to basically come to the aid of the civilians who have lost homes, who have had their homes damaged, who have potentially been in areas that have been isolated and without services. So that's been a very important aspect of this that isn't really talked about, that the Iranian government throughout the 40 days has been very much focused not only on the war, but also on serving its population and enabling them to survive the war, to survive the deprivation in many areas. So I think that's been a very important aspect of this pause, which hasn't been focused on because the focus has been on the Hormuz Straits. And I think the only other thing I want to point out is that, as Myriam said, the war of attrition against the US forces in the region has been tremendous. Most of their bases in the Zionist Arab states on the Persian Gulf have been severely damaged and rendered, in many cases, as far as I can see from the satellite images, largely inoperable. Trump talks again and again, and Western media is talking about the buildup of troops. But until now, it's not gone above the 50,000, which is a ridiculous number if they're talking about a ground invasion, because even in Iraq, it was something, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it was 1 million troops around that number that were used in Iraq. And Iran, you're talking a vast territory, a lot of it mountainous, a lot of it impenetrable, and 97 million or 90 million population, 27 million of whom have signed up to defend the country as conscripts, should there be a ground invasion. There are thousands of people transporting themselves to the 3 islands that might come under ground attack, like Kaj Island, for example. And there is potential, again, speaking to Ehsan Safanajad the other day, he said, the most likely target will be the islands, to try and take control of the islands in the kind of disputed islands in the Hormuz Strait. But as he said, even this won't last. Even if they make it with special forces onto those islands, they're going to get kicked off again very quickly, right? So I'm not quite sure. I agree with Myriam. They're going to take it up a notch. And I think Iran is now going to. They've already said, whatever you target in Iran, we're going to be targeting external to Iran in areas that are allying themselves with the United States or are harboring United States assets on their territory. There's also been notification from the Islamic resistance in Iraq of a buildup within Iraqi Kurdistan area, and with Americans giving weapons to the Kurdish terrorist groups there, which in my opinion is completely insane, because are they going to take on the Iranian special forces on the eastern border and the PMU and the Islamic resistance in Iraq? And the Kurds are not renowned for their courage. My apologies to any Kurdish supporters, but they are really, look at the history in Syria, the history in Iraq, where they betrayed the Christians in Iraq and left them to be, and the Yazidis, to be massacred by ISIS. They don't have a reputation of courage. And the US is not going to support them, just as it hasn't supported the Gulf states. So other than increasing bombardment of Iranian infrastructure, at the moment, I think the ground invasion is another bluff by Trump, but I'd be interested in getting Myriam's take on that.
Largely, I think it is a bluff, but it might not be. There are scenarios in which they would be thinking where it's not, and those scenarios are very dangerous precedents for the world. So it would be major bombing campaigns, and now the bombing, I'm not sure what kind of bombing we're talking about. We can be talking about bombings we've never seen before, below the threshold of nuclear bombs. There's a whole section between what we've seen in nuclear bombs that has never been used, and I think we're about to see something within that. It could have some form of tactical nuke, or I don't know. I'm not much of a military person, but it could have a version of it.
Do you think we could see biological weapons being used?
Yes, that's the other version of weapons that we have not used, and or we have not seen being used. And so, that being said, I think on some of the islands, something of the sort might be prepared. Let's be clear, this will never work on Iran mainland. So
No, exactly.
all of these scenarios are most likely to happen on either the Iraq-Iran kind of small border, so like 2-3 kilometers in, and not into not deep into Iran, or towards the islands, in my opinion. We might see something of biological weapons being used. We might see tactical weapons being used. We might see a mix of both. We might see something similar to the shock and awe, but bigger, on a smaller piece of land. And through that, the Americans might attempt some form of ground invasion, but it would also be limited to the extent to which they can spread themselves, right? So, so I don't know how viable it is to talk about major ground invasion. There is no grounds for that, because the Iranian people, what we saw in Isfahan was an attempt. And it was not a mistake on behalf of the Americans. They were driven right into an ambush, right? So it was not like they weren't prepared for it. No, they were prepared for a certain kind of confrontation in Isfahan. What they were not prepared for is the air defense ambush, the people that were willing to shoot at them from everywhere. And these were largely tribesmen that were willing to shoot from all directions. But the primary failure in Isfahan was the Iranian special ops that were ready, and they knew exactly where the Americans are gonna land, right? They drove them to the ambush spot. And so by doing that, the Iranians proved that they understand US military mentality very well. They have studied it. They've studied it in Iraq. They've studied it likely in Armenia with the Nagorno-Karabakh, the war with Azerbaijan. They studied it in Russia, Ukraine, how the Ukrainians are functioning, where the Russians are messing up, how it's developing, and they are capable now of driving the enemy right into a located, preset ambush, right? And that means that not only will they face special ops, they might even face missile strikes. We might be seeing a direct missile strike on a certain ambush, right? We are looking at a very different kind of war than what we saw beforehand. And I think either that or the Americans are signing off their death in Iran, to be honest. Because after the second part of the war, I do not believe the Americans will have much dignity, let alone the superiority to claim any efficient influence in West Asia beyond the political economic influence, whatever that may remain. So we're also looking at the mobilization in Iraq. While they have done miracles in Iraq, the resistance, I mean, it remains that a lot needs to be done. Iraq is very big, and the enemy is both foreign and local. There's a lot of collaborators, similar to the situation in Lebanon. And in addition to that, there's Syria on the border. So all of these mobilizations that could happen in Iraq draw an image of what kind of attrition the US will be facing if they attempt ground invasion in Iran. And that attrition is not a minor attrition, because the US leaving Iraq means the abandonment of Syria. And the abandonment of Syria means the encircling of the US in Mount Lebanon and Tel Aviv. This is what would remain in that geographical presence. And then there's Jordan, but no one really takes that into large consideration because Jordan is a consequence and not a core. The presence in Lebanon is part core, part consequence, but to a large degree, if it doesn't have a back, it cannot stand, to put it that way. And if they lose Syria now, by losing Iraq, they will eventually leave Lebanon on their own. I don't think there will be a need for the kind of confrontation people have imagined. And so for the Americans, the attrition is much bigger than the concern of going into Iran. The going into Iran is an image of victory, largely, which they might try to achieve in various ways. They might take over a ship, they might do, I don't know, something at a very small scale and then blow it up in a PR campaign as full achievement, and Trump can come out and make some lies about how this was great and he ended, like, I don't know, 12 wars now. I don't know what count he's on.
Oh, way more
He's
than that,
definitely,
surely.
I don't, yeah. So from here, I think the Americans are looking at bombing again, surely, but not as we've seen before because that has failed. We also know for a fact that now the Americans also studied how we have been operating. So they definitely studied how Iran has been operating, how the resistance has been operating, how Iraq has been operating. So we might also be looking at surprises on our end. That is not to say that the Americans no longer have cards to play. No, they do. And these cards might be very painful, just so that we are clear from a position of understanding the conflict, that a major operation which causes us as resistance movements and Axis heavy losses will not come as a shock. We are waiting for it. We are expecting it because we understand how they operate. We've seen it with the Pagers attack. We've seen it with the assassinations. You've seen it in very various eras and ways. But any sort of attack of this form could be framed by the Americans as an image of victory and the Israelis, but it will not alter anything on the ground. And the point now, from what I understand from from an Iranian diplomatic perspective, is the goal is to show to the entire world that America has failed. That is the agreement that's happening in Pakistan. Everything else is a consequence of achieving that. Because they could have achieved some sort of agreement with certain compromises, and we could have went into another 20 years of kind of Cold War between Iran and the US. But what is clear for Iran is that the point of achieving the goals diplomatically is exactly the point of achieving the goals militarily, and that is to say the Americans have failed. So if that negotiation does not lead to that, and an admission of failure by a compromise from the American side without any equal compromise from the Iranian side, that is the goal. That's the point. And if that happens, the Americans lose the Gulf. And by lose the Gulf, I mean the economy that allows the Americans to flourish in the Gulf will alter. And with that altering, the Gulf would have larger freedom of operation, and we might see a whole different map coming along, and whole different versions of alliances coming along in the Gulf, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in the whole region. And that different map is not Russia coming in and putting bases anywhere, and it's not China coming in and putting bases at anywhere. They will definitely be part of the change, right? Because they are major powers in the region. But that involvement will not be from saving the Arab and Islamic world position. It will be from a point of interest and mutual interest, shared interest between these groups, which is something that does exist. Despite the fact that we know that Russia and China also have mutual interests with the Americans and the Israelis, right? No one denies that. It's just the range of mutual interest between China and the US and Russia and the US is smaller than the mutual interest between Europe and the US. But they all have some sort of mutual interest. And so from that perspective, things might alter. But I think we're looking at a whole different world, and Iran has been acknowledged, apologies, by a lot of scholars as the new superpower, right? And when we talk about Iran as the new superpower, we're not talking about just Iran, the state. We're talking about Iran Wilayat al-Faqih. So we're talking about Iran, the Islamic Republic, which has real allies in the whole of West Asia, in the Islamic and the Arab worlds. And I insist on the term allyship because it comes with the specificity of freedom of operation without permission from Iran, but within the framework of a just confrontation, right? And that's just to say it's the same concept that we have in Christianity. We talk about just war theory in Vatican. We talk about that. Much less now, but that's because the Vatican abandoned the people and not because the theory itself no longer exists. We kind of lost that when we decided to separate state and religion. The Muslims did not do that. So from their perspective, it's a bit different on that note. These are two different experiences. And in general, those two different experiences have shown that the minorities or so-called minorities and the two different experiences have experienced life differently to a large degree in this region, whether it's the Jews, the Christians, the Yazidis, or really any of the ethnicities or sects that exist. We are perceived as an entire part of the fabric of society and not as sidelined kind of minorities, to each the role, to each their goal, to each their capacity within the framework agreed upon in the past. We do not see much of the same in the West. There is always that struggle between the individual and the capitalist system, and that has turned every single individual into a minority, really, unless you fit into the elite class. So it's a really different perception of the world, and from that we can say that Iran has emerged as a superpower because of its role, because of its ability to engage with the whole region as a partner and not as a sovereign.
Is this why Trump is using rhetoric like destroying the entire civilization? Is that what they actually fear?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think this is a very important point when you look at Iran and what it represents as actually, if you take out the Islamic nature, if you actually look at the structure of governance in Iran, if you look at the financial system, if you look at healthcare, education, which is still free and available for everyone, but particularly if you look at the financial system, which in 1983, a law was actually passed that banks would have to operate under usury-free systems. And as many of the more aware financial commentators now are starting to understand when they're talking about a kind of global technocratic alliance that is bringing in the CBDC, the AI surveillance, and so on and so forth, Iran is actually external to this in its internal government system, in its sustaining free healthcare, free education across the country, so across a population of 90 million. And then look at the banking system, which is completely divorced from any kind of global capitalist system, right? And so this in itself is an anathema to a West or to the United States that is trying to build. And, I take Trump out of the equation at this because we know that the presidents are only representatives of those that are bringing them to power and are maintaining them in power while they fulfill a part of the roadmap that is actually leading to the destination designed by the technocracy behind the throne, if you like. And so for them, it's incredibly important to dismantle Iran as an example, as Myriam touched on. What is happening is Iran, even in the West now, for people that are really looking deeply into this, that are reading the Iranian constitution, that are actually kind of going behind the sort of grating of propaganda that prevents you looking further than should women wear their hijab or not. And this is the deliberate ploy by the West to prevent people actually looking at what Iran represents. One, the core ideology of Shia Muslim is the protection of the oppressed, rather than expansion or subjugation of the enemy. No, it's about, so if, in other words, if the oppression of Lebanon ceases, or the oppression of Palestine ceases, or the oppression of Syria ceases, and so on, then Iran steps back. But the thing is, that isn't happening. And when people look at a victory in this war, they tend to look at, well, who's throwing the most bombs, who has the least casualties, who is gaining ground, etc., etc. They're looking at it in a very, in my opinion, kind of war video game narrative scenario. But the reality is, just by surviving, Iran and the entire resistance axis are winning. If you look at Lebanon and you look at April the 8th, what happened on April the 8th, and the massacre that entailed from 150 bombs dropped by Israel in the space of 10 minutes in heavily populated civilian areas, some of the poorest areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut, you would think, you know, that's it, it's the end, right? But brute force doesn't equal victory. Survival and the maintenance of the entire mechanism of resistance and attrition and survival is what brings victory. And if Iran can survive whatever Israel and the US throws at it, it's won. Because the longer it survives and the longer it doesn't compromise, again, as Myriam said, people understand what holds this country up. And if you look at the people in Iran are still going to their streets in their tens, hundreds of thousands across the country. Why? And I posted about this yesterday. Because those people know they're not disenfranchised. Those people know that they can bring pressure to bear upon the Iranian government, whether it's revolutionary members of that government or reformist members of that government, to act according to their wishes. And their wishes is to not compromise, not to close the Hormuz Strait, to defend Lebanon and the entire resistance axis, or to support it, and to not come away with anything but the victory. And that puts, the fact that those people are still going on the streets puts that pressure on the government to take decisions which are not going to turn against the people. Let me just finish. You don't find that level of power from the people in the West now, do you?
Yeah, so when we talk about Iran from the ability of the people to take decisions in Iran, Iran is actually the closest thing to the ideal democracy that people have lived in their heads but never in experience. Iran is the closest thing to that as a structure, right? And in the same way, it perceives the entire resistance movement in the region. And to that degree, the reason why Iran would not compromise on any of the resistance movements in the region is, as long as they don't compromise, is quite particularly not just mutual interest, because there is an aspect of mutual interest between the two, but there is an ideological belief that if they do compromise, then this is a sin. They have sinned because these people have counted on them. They have built their trust with them. And they have built their entire strategy of confrontation on a concept that Iran would not sell out. Now, let's be clear, if, when it's very far away, if Iran does compromise, that does not mean the resistance will disintegrate, per se. There will always be some version of resistance, as it was and it has existed before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the Islamic Revolution in Iran was actually largely, its supporters were trained by Hafiz al-Assad in Syria. The concept of resistance in the region goes far back from the Islamic Revolution. But its backing has given the resistance movement so much power because it has a full economic system, it has a full religious system, it has the full backing of Shias across the entire region and the world, and it has the backing of all folks who are not Shia in the region that back the resistance. You can go and support them in various ways, to put it that way, whether it's financially or materially or otherwise. And so from that perspective, understanding that Iran treats the decisions it makes based on the will of the people, as long as it fits into the ethics of the religion, we can see that the decision making in Iran is actually far beyond the border of Persia. And I say that because Iran itself has an internal issue, which is the divide between the Persian identity and the Islamic identity. And there has been several clashes at many times, but Ayatollah Imam Khomeini and Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, peace be upon them, what they were able to do is they were able to reconcile the two between history and ethics. This has been the point of reconciliation. Neither of them denied the Persian history, and everybody knows Persia is one of the places that has never been truly conquered. And that comes from a history and not just the mythology of Persia. But the ethics that were added through the Islamic Revolution built upon a lot of the Persian ethics. And those ethics matched exactly the ethics of the wider area in which Persia exists in, and which has been a necessary, continuous, undeniable integration between Persia, the Turkmen in Turkey today, and the Arabs. And if we put all of this into context, we understand that today, when the resistance in Lebanon says, we will go to war for the blood of Sayyid Ali Khamenei, they do not just mean the person. Regardless of the fact that if it were up to me, I would say this man deserves, at the very least, this kind of response. But more than that, it's because the initial aggression on him was an aggression on the identity of the Islamic Revolution and the identity of the whole region, which has always been interconnected between Persia and the Arabs, always, historically. Regardless of some parts of history where there was wars between them, and that's a natural kind of process. But there was never a time in which trade and socioeconomic ties were actually fully broken. There was never a time like that. And so when you attack these two aspects, you're attacking the core of the entire region. And to do that, you don't just need to eliminate the civilization in Iran. You need to eliminate the civilization everywhere, because the Wilayat al-Faqih came from Mount Amil in South Lebanon. The concept of it came from Mount Amil in South Lebanon and not from Qom, right? So when we understand that dynamic, we see that no, the war that Trump is launching is a war on our entire people in this part of the world in West Asia.
Earlier on, Vanessa said if you take out the Islamic aspect of it, this, for people that are in the West trying to understand what's going on with Iran or in Iran at the moment, they are, obviously bombarded with rhetoric about it being an Islamic dictatorship. But there's also a diaspora in the West that some may support the old regime of the Shah. Others are against that, but they're also against the Islamic Republic. How are people to get a sort of an objective view of what Iran is actually like? Um, because we're bombarded with so much propaganda about what Iran is like, and of course that propaganda is largely um, providing support for this ongoing action.
Um, I think, first of all, follow Iranian commentators, particularly the academics, female academics that are commentating on social media and are appearing on YouTube interviews and so on, because you will get a completely different perspective about life in Iran. This is always the problem. I mean, in Syria, who was the greatest enemy of Syria? It was the diaspora Syrians that are paid by the West to effectively support their regime change narratives. And that's exactly what is happening. You know, how can you support so-called Iranians who were probably born in diaspora, have grown up in the American or the European or the UK education system and benefit from working within the system that is trying to destroy their country and are literally calling for the bombardment of their own people, sanctions upon their own people? In my opinion, they shouldn't be allowed citizenship of the country that they're calling for the destruction of. The same way that Mansour Hadi in 2015 left Yemen. He wasn't kicked out. He had actually already resigned twice, but on the basis of what happened in 2015, he went to Saudi Arabia and called for the bombing of his people and the sanctioning of his people. You know, this is utterly criminal, in my opinion. The same thing happened in Syria. Who ensured that the sanctions were not only maintained on Syria, but were increased to a barbaric level with the Caesar sanctions that the first Trump administration brought in? The problem is that when I say, I don't want to be insulting by saying, when you look past the Islamic perspective, but in a way, people in the West need to do that. They need to look at how the system actually works in Iran and compare it to how it works in the West. We don't have, I mean, democracy is just a mirage in the West. It's just terminology like the missionary terminology, which is used to actually subjugate, colonize, invade, and send countries back, as Trump has said, to the Stone Ages. Literally, that is what they're doing. And they are erasing culture, civilization systematically. If you look at the damage that's being done to the history in Syria, the culture in Syria, the civilization in Syria, in Yemen, they were bombing some of the most ancient civilizational structures from the beginning. In Lebanon, what are they doing now? They're targeting Sur or Tyre, as people will know it. Again, one of the most incredible historic sites in the country. And so
they did that in Syria too.
Yeah, Palmyra,
right?
You know, overtaken twice by ISIS and destroyed exponentially each time. So I think, you know, I don't know how you break through this kind of collective hypnosis and fear of the Islamophobia, really, which has been created and maintained by the Zionists. They were the ones that gave life to this concept of Islamic extremism, which then led to Islamophobia. And that's why I'm saying, I don't know if people can try to view it not through the lens of Islam, because I'm not a religious person. I tend not to view things through the Christian lens or the Islamic lens or any religious lens, but I look at it through the lens of humanity. What system serves humanity? What system serves their people? What system takes care of their population and the poorest of their population? I've witnessed that myself in Iran, where the poorest areas in Tehran are receiving free gas, free water, free heating, free fuel. We don't have that in the West, and yet we're supposedly exporting our system as being, the utopia for the future. It isn't. So I guess from my perspective, as it's not that I don't believe, it's just I don't adhere to any one particular ideology or religion, but I look at it through the lens of humanity. And when I look at it through the lens of humanity, even in Syria, let's take Syria as an example. I lived there for 5 years, worked there for 10 years. The health system was the jewel in the crown of this region. The Al-Kindi Cancer Hospital was the largest and most advanced in the region and was blown up by terrorist suicide bombers, truck bombers. Right now, what's happening under Jolani, the Al-Qaeda regime that was put in power by the West to give freedom to the people and bring democracy to Syria, what is he doing? He's privatizing the health service, one. And I saw a report like 2 or 3 days ago that broke my heart. There are now outbreaks of scabies and other diseases in the hospitals. These hospitals where people were going for free healthcare the whole time I was there. I benefited from it on at least 2 occasions. It was one of the best health systems I've ever experienced and the fastest. And now that is being eroded and privatized. And so it's heading the way of the utopian, in their view, West. And it's a dystopia for the people here who have effectively benefited from the best systems until they're eroded and destroyed and eradicated by the collective West and the Zionist entity.
I fully agree with what Vanessa is saying. What I also have to add is that Tasneem is just saying that it looks like the Iranians will not go into round 2 because of Trump's excessive demands and his blockade. So I think we're gonna go back into the threshold of confrontation much faster than anticipated, at least by the people in the West, because of the analysis I've seen on Twitter and on outlets. We're definitely going back into a confrontation. I can confirm that yesterday there was an aggression in South Lebanon targeting an individual. We have 1 martyr, and we have had massive demolitions across the border, all of which are considered, I would not call them violations. They are direct attacks and a continuation of the Israeli war on Lebanon. And I believe perhaps in the next few hours, 24, 48 hours, we're going to see a different positioning from the resistance from the region, perhaps even from the Americans, according to what's being revealed now.
Well, since you mentioned Lebanon, I did want to just touch on that because obviously over the last few days, the supposed ceasefire was brought in, and by the way, Trump did already claim that to be his 12th success. But anyway, obviously there's been talk of negotiations for the first time between Israel and Lebanon, and I wanted to get some insight from you, Myriam, about what the Lebanese government position is going to be, because my understanding is, and you tell me if this is wrong, that they are generally positive feeling towards Israel, and that Israel would very much like to see some kind of deal done with the Lebanese government so that Hezbollah is being hit from both sides effectively.
You see, this is like I don't know if you have kids, Mike, but it's like me going up to one of your kids and making an agreement with them that we are gonna kick you out of the house, and then you come in and you do whatever you want and you stay in the house and there's nothing that your kid can do about it. Right? But we had an agreement. Like there is an agreement between us, right? And you look at them and you can't actually do that. It's useless, to put it that way. It's irrelevant. And to fix the wrong here, it is not unprecedented. In 1982, Bashir Gemayel became president of Lebanon while Israel besieged Beirut. And here locally, he is known to have come to the presidency atop an Israeli tank. So, so from that perspective, Bashir Gemayel was elected president forcefully at a time when the American New Jersey was at the shores of Beirut, and when the Israelis were in the heart of Beirut, besieging it. And what happened later was that a man called Habib Shartouni, he assassinated Bashir Gemayel, to put it that way. And that assassination was known locally and across the region as imposing the decision of the people, of rejecting any normalization with the Israeli enemy. There was a plan at the time of his election of normalizing ties between Beirut and Tel Aviv. And his brother Amin Gemayel, who became president after him, moved on to sign that agreement in 1983. And then what happened is basically nothing. That agreement didn't go into effect. It was during the war, there was a coup there, and ultimately the New Jersey and the Americans and the Green Beret in Beirut were bombed with the famous operation against them, and then the Israelis were forced out of Lebanon until liberation in 2000. They were gradually moving backwards. And so what I can confirm is that Lebanon has a history of dealing with traitors in the way they understand. So it's up to the presidency, up to the government to understand the extent of their power and the limitations that they face before it's too late. The statement by President Aoun yesterday proved that the political Maronite echelon has failed to learn anything from their history and has failed to read regional changes at a time when the Americans themselves have been capable of doing that. The French themselves have been capable of doing that. And they're throwing, once again, their whole bets into one bucket, and that bucket seems to be on a sinking ship. So it seems that we are facing a major confrontation. A statement by Mr. Mahmoud Qmati came out today, and a statement by Haj Wafi Safa was made yesterday through the BBC. Both of them said the same thing. Primarily, the resistance will never disarm. And if they can disarm it, they're welcome to try. But that would lead to a direct confrontation, not with the armed resistance, but with the people who support the armed resistance. And I can confirm that the people who support the armed resistance in this country are not defined to a sect. And I think to a large degree, the political echelon knows that. And what is happening is that they're trying to convince Riyadh to continue to support Nawaf Salam and President Aoun. But ultimately, it seems that Riyadh is also connecting with Iran and the resistance. And Nabih Berri, who's the Speaker of Parliament, but he is also the head of the Amal movement, which is known as kind of a sister political party to Hezbollah. And they are both the two major Shia parties in the country, because this is a sectarian country. Don't call me sectarian. The country is divided in sectarian terms, and our political positions are divided in sectarian terms. The president is always a Maronite, the Speaker of Parliament is always a Shia, and the head of the government is always a Sunni. And these positions require the full support of their sect for it to be able to function and operate. And it seems that the Sunnis in Lebanon are not largely backing Nawaf Salam. And so we're looking at potential of a direct confrontation. However, the ones who can, so a civil war requires two parties, right? The ones who can lead the civil war, which are the resistance movement, they reject it. And the ones who don't want or cannot lead it don't have the capacity to start one. So from that perspective, we're looking at confrontation that might not even need to happen, because what has been clear since the era of Martyr Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah is that at any point when the confrontation could turn into internal attrition, what's going to happen is we're going to hit the head of the snake. The head of the snake is the Americans, and on the ground, it's the Israelis. For this time, we don't know when that will change. But for now, I believe that we will not even get near doing so. And if in the event Joseph Aoun heads to Washington and signs an agreement, I highly doubt he will be able to come back. He would be worried for his life, because the majority of the people of Lebanon reject any form of normalization and are willing to defend it by any means possible, because that is the will of the people, and that is our constitution, actually. And in the case of grand betrayal, it is constitutionally acceptable for the people to impose their decision. And until this moment, the constitution has not changed. There has not been an alteration in the constitution. So any meeting between a Lebanese and an Israeli is actually, it would actually result in grand betrayal and would actually result in jail time. Until this moment, there are lawyers putting forward accusations against the Lebanese ambassador in Washington, who has met with the Israeli ambassador, and that is a breach of the constitution. And in the event that the president picks up the call with Netanyahu or meets him in Washington, that would be much of the same. So this is going to unfold. But Lebanon does have a history of a group wanting normalization, and a group that is heavily backed by the US wanting normalization in the face of the majority, which does not want it and will not abandon its right to not want it. From that perspective, we have more than 2,000 martyrs in this war. We have more than 10,000 martyrs since 2023. I don't think people are going to compromise on the blood of these martyrs.
Does the United States have a significant enough presence in Lebanon to change that?
Change what? When the US had its biggest presence in Lebanon was in the 1980s. They failed. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. When they had their biggest presence militarily, politically, the Israelis had taken over Beirut. The Americans had taken over the north of Beirut, which is known as Eastern. So we had Eastern and Western Beirut, right? So the Americans were on one side, the Israelis were on another, and American ships were right at the shore. There was a plan of taking the Christians out on ships and getting them out of the country at some point, and we refused. Alternatively, they brought in Bashir Gemayel on an Israeli tank for presidency, and ultimately, with all of this power that the West had in Beirut, what it accumulated to was utter failure, and what it accumulated to was the Ta'if agreement, which was never signed in Riyadh without the one clause which says the right of the resistance to fight an occupier by all means necessary at all times, right? And that was a war in Riyadh during the Ta'if negotiations. And at the time, there was an MP, and he was Sunni actually, and Nabih Birri, who insisted on that clause being present at the time where the Americans were pushing on eliminating it. So this was the peak power of the US in the region. And the Ta'if the US even went to Syria and said, listen, you have to back the Ta'if, because otherwise the situation was going to expand in the region. But no one had the capacity to face it. So the Syrians agreed, and they went towards the Ta'if agreement, and they were the supervisors of the Ta'if agreement, in fact. So today, we don't have Syria backing us, but what we do have is that we have a unified axis of resistance that has the capacity to impose on the ground what they want at the time when the Americans have failed to do so, and they will not allow the Americans to achieve diplomatically what they failed to achieve militarily. I don't know if that explains it, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're just about out of time now, but I wanted to end by getting both your thoughts on the other Islamic countries in the region, and want, clearly this is going to start up again. What is their position likely to be as the war fighting becomes a regional problem again? Are they going to stick with the United States, or are they going to shift their allegiance?
Riyadh is trying to sell to the Iranians in Lebanon, saying, listen, you can, I think this is what they're saying. I don't have a direct confirmation of that, but it seems like what they're saying is, listen, you can bomb the Americans, but leave us out of it. And please tell the Yemenis to leave us out of it in the case that this expands. The UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain are directly following through with the Americans until the last breath. Qatar is also looking for a margin of operation between the Iranians and the Americans. I think these are the only two countries that are rationally looking at a certain stability after this war. And otherwise, Kuwait, UAE, and Bahrain, they know their presence could not exist without the Americans. And so they're willing to go to the end with that. Riyadh has its own specificities. It can reach an agreement ultimately with Yemen and survive in some shape or form. Qatar is the same, reaching an agreement with Iran and survive in some shape or form. The rest is really a non-existent entity that became existent by U.S. force of economy and military. And Kuwait returns to Iraq. They know that. In the case that the Americans fail, Kuwaitis know that very well, that their only margin of survival is in a full agreement and integration in some shape or form with Iraq. So I don't think we're looking at a lot of things changed between the first confrontation and the other, except for Riyadh and Qatar.
When you talk about Qatar, I also connect Turkey to that because the collaboration between Qatar and Turkey is based around, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood that were to some degree weaponized also against Syria, both in the late 70s, early 80s when Hafez al-Assad was president, and then, of course, again since 2011. But I think Turkey knows full well that if the US and Israel, which I don't think they're going to, but if, for example, they were to be able to defeat the resistance, then of course that means they're moving forward with the Zionist expansion agenda, which at some point would also include perceiving Turkey as a threat. And that is already being spoken about in Israeli media, that maybe Turkey is the next Iran and so on. And so therefore, I think, while I don't trust Erdogan at all, and Turkey under Erdogan has a reputation of deceit and false rhetoric and so on, but I think ultimately, the longer that this war goes on, I think you'll see both Qatar and Turkey fall into kind of the scenario where Turkey has not responded to the false flags that were carried out on their territory. They're not going to go to war with Iran. That's number one, in my opinion. But eventually what you might see, Turkey will go towards whoever is going to win the war and give them the benefits out of this, right? And so I think you might see some recalibration of Turkey's relationship with Iran. Currently, covertly, there is obviously a relationship between Iran and Turkey anyway, but I think it might become more overt. Then, of course, I would hope at some point we're going to see a rejection of Jolani and the Al-Qaeda regime in Syria, because, as Myriam said, they're going to be encircled at that point. So I think, the gains for the resistance are huge in this war. And I think that's what, we tend to focus upon, because in the West, the media is very focused upon the Trump rhetoric, upon, a very much a Western-centric view of what's happening. But here in the region, when you take a step back from the daily sacrifice of the members of the resistance and the civilians that support the resistance, which is horrific. It really is heartbreaking. But when you look at the bigger picture, then the vision of victory is huge, actually.
Okay, well, that seems like a good place to leave it for today. Thank you very much, Myriam and Vanessa. Myriam, great to have you on the program, and we will hopefully see you both back on this program very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Have a good one.